She had a routine. Most people do, but Karina Vetrano wore hers like armor. Up early, coffee, the kind of morning energy that made people around her feel like the day was already worth something. She was 30 years old, a speech therapist working with children in Manhattan, and she carried that work with her the way people carry things they genuinely love. Her patients weren't just cases on a clipboard. They were kids who struggled to find their words, and she was the person who helped them find them. She lived with her parents in Howard Beach, Queens, a tight-knit neighborhood, the kind of place where people know each other's names, where front porches still mean something, where a retired firefighter and his wife raise a daughter who turns out exactly the way they hoped. Her father, Phil, was that retired firefighter. And the two of them had a ritual, running together through Spring Creek Park, a vast nature preserve that stretched along the edge of their world. It wasn't glamorous. It was overgrown and marshy and half forgotten by the city that surrounded it. But it was theirs, a father and daughter side by side moving through the reeds. On August 2nd, 2016, Phil stayed home. A back injury. Nothing serious. The kind of thing you push through on a Tuesday and rest on a Wednesday. Karina wasn't worried. She told him she'd be fine. She laced up her shoes, stepped out into the late afternoon heat, and headed toward the park alone. She had run those paths 100 times. She knew every turn, every stretch of trail where the reeds grew tall enough to block the sun. Every place where the ground softened into marsh and you had to watch your footing. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. This was her park, her route, her rhythm. But somewhere along that path, in the thick, isolated quiet of Spring Creek, something happened that no amount of familiarity could have prepared her for. Karina Vetrano never came home. And what followed? The search, the grief, the investigation, the science, the courtroom, and the questions that still haven't fully been answered, is a story that cuts to the heart of what justice actually looks like when a community is broken open by loss. To understand what happened to Karina Vetrano, you have to understand the place where it happened. Spring Creek Park doesn't look like what most people picture when they hear the word park. There are no manicured lawns, and no benches every 50 feet, no joggers weaving around strollers and dog walkers on a clean, well-lit path. Spring Creek is something older and wilder than that. A 390-acre nature preserve wedged between Howard Beach in Queens and East New York and Brooklyn, sitting at the edge of Jamaica Bay like a place the city forgot to finish building. It is beautiful in the way that untamed things are beautiful. Tall marsh grasses that sway in the wind off the water. Egrets picking through the shallows. The kind of silence you don't expect to find inside New York City limits. But that beauty comes with a cost, because Spring Creek is also deeply, structurally isolated. The reeds grow 10 feet high in places. The trails wind through dense brush that swallows sound. Large sections of the park are completely hidden from the street, from passing cars, from anyone who isn't already standing inside it. It is the kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear you. Karina knew the park. That's important to say clearly. She wasn't wandering into unfamiliar territory. She had run those trails alongside her father dozens of times. She understood the terrain, the layout, the way the light changed in the late afternoon when the sun dropped behind the tree line. For her, Spring Creek wasn't a risk. It was a routine. And routines, as investigators would later note, are both a comfort and a vulnerability. August 2016 was a Tuesday. The temperature had climbed into the mid-80s. Thick, humid New York summer heat that sits on your skin and doesn't move. Karina left her home in Howard Beach at around 5 o'clock in the evening. Her father, Phil, was home with a back injury that had kept him off the trail that day. She reassured him before she left. She would be fine. She always was. She stepped into the park as the afternoon was beginning to soften into early evening. The light was still good. The trail was familiar. There was no reason, not a single visible reason, to believe that this run would be any different from the 100 that came before it. But somewhere in that park, in those tall reeds, on that familiar path, someone was already there. Phil Vetrano knew something was wrong before he had proof of it. That's the thing about parents, especially parents who share a ritual with their child. There's a clock that runs in the background, quiet and automatic, that starts ticking the moment they leave and doesn't stop until they're back. Phil knew how long Karina's runs took. He knew her pace, her route, her habits. And when the time stretched past what it should have been, that clock got louder. He called her phone. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. By the time the sun had fully dropped and the park had gone dark, Phil Vetrano wasn't waiting anymore. He went looking for his daughter himself, moving through the same trails they had run together, calling her name into the reeds, into the dark, into the silence that gave nothing back. What he found, deep in the marsh grass of Spring Creek Park, was something no parent should ever have to find. Karina was there. She had not made it out of the park. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her body showed signs of a violent, sustained attack, the kind that forensic examiners would later describe as prolonged and brutal. She was found face down in the tall grass, off the main trail, in a section of the park so overgrown and isolated that it was effectively invisible from any public vantage point. Phil Vetrano called 911, and then, in the way that grief sometimes moves before the mind can catch up with it, he stayed with her. When police arrived, they were dealing with two things simultaneously: a crime scene and a father who had just discovered his daughter's body. Both required care. Both required precision. And the NYPD, to their credit, understood immediately that what they were looking at was not a random act of chaos. This was a targeted, deliberate attack. The location, the nature of the assault, and the degree of violence, it all pointed to someone who had been in that park with intent. The medical examiner's findings confirmed what the scene suggested. Karina had been strangled manually, meaning with bare hands, and sexually assaulted. The attack had been sustained. She had fought back. And critically, her attacker had left something behind. DNA. This is where the case pivots, because in the absence of witnesses, in the absence of surveillance cameras, in the absence of any immediate suspect, DNA became everything. Investigators recovered biological material from Karina's body and her fingernails. Clean, usable, high-quality DNA, evidence that could, in theory, identify her killer with near certainty. The problem was simple and devastating. They had the DNA. They just didn't have a name to match it to. The news of Karina's murder hit Howard Beach like a physical thing. This was a neighborhood that prided itself on looking out for its own. A close community where people knew each other across generations, where a retired firefighter and his daughter running through the local park was exactly the kind of ordinary, wholesome detail that defined daily life. The idea that something like this could happen there, on a familiar trail, in the early evening. It didn't just frighten people. It shattered something. Vigils were held. Her photo, bright-eyed, smiling, full of the kind of energy that photographs somehow managed to capture, circulated everywhere. And the question that sat underneath all of it, unspoken but constant, was the same one investigators were already racing to answer. Who did this? The NYPD doesn't lack resources. That's worth saying up front, because what happened in the weeks and months after Karina Vetrano's murder wasn't a failure of effort or funding or manpower. Detectives from the Queens Homicide Squad worked the case hard. Tips were followed. Persons of interest were looked at and cleared. The park was combed. The neighborhood was canvassed. Every tool available to one of the largest police departments in the world was pointed at this case. And still, nothing moved. The DNA profile sat in the system, clean and complete, waiting for a match that didn't come. Investigators ran it through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, the national database that holds genetic profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees across the country. No hit. Whoever had attacked Karina Vetrano either had no prior criminal record that had generated a DNA sample, or had somehow slipped through the gaps in a system that, for all its reach, is not without its blind spots. This is the first wall, and it's a wall that investigators in DNA-dependent cases hit more often than the public realizes. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, is the backbone of forensic DNA investigation in the United States. It contains over 20 million profiles drawn from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic evidence collected at crime scenes. When investigators recovered DNA from a crime scene, They upload a profile and run it against the database. If there's a match, they have a name. If there isn't, they wait. The system is powerful, but it has structural limitations. It only contains profiles of people who have already been arrested or convicted of qualifying offenses. First-time offenders, people who have never been processed through the criminal justice system, or individuals whose records exist in other jurisdictions but haven't been properly uploaded. All of them can fall through the cracks. In Karina's case, the DNA was there. The science was solid, but the database had nothing to offer. So investigators pivoted. If the database couldn't give them a name, they would build one from the ground up. In the months following the murder, the NYPD conducted what became one of the largest DNA dragnets in New York City history. Detectives fanned out across Howard Beach, East New York, and the surrounding neighborhoods, approaching men, asking for voluntary DNA swabs, collecting samples and running them against the profile recovered from Karina's body. It was a massive, resource-intensive operation, and it was not without controversy. Civil liberties advocates raised immediate concerns. Voluntary in this context is a complicated word. When a detective approaches you and asks for a DNA sample in connection with a murder investigation, the social and psychological pressure to comply is significant, regardless of what the law technically requires. Questions were raised about who was being approached, how those decisions were being made, and whether certain communities were bearing a disproportionate share of the scrutiny. Those concerns were real. They were also in the immediate aftermath of a brutal murder, largely drowned out by the urgency of the investigation. Hundreds of samples were collected, hundreds of men were cleared, and still, no match. Months passed. The case stayed open. Phil Vetrano, Karina's father, became a visible and vocal presence, speaking at press conferences, pushing for answers, refusing to let the investigation fade into the background noise of a city that moves fast and forgets faster. His grief was raw and public and entirely without performance. He was a father who wanted to know who killed his daughter, and he was not going to stop asking. The NYPD, for their part, kept working. But by the time a full year had passed since Karina's murder, the case had taken on the particular weight of an investigation that is still open, but has run out of obvious places to look. The DNA was still there. The profile was still clean. The match still hadn't come. And then, in a way that no one had anticipated, it did. It didn't come from a tip. It didn't come from a witness stepping forward after a year of silence. It didn't come from a surveillance camera that investigators had somehow missed, or a piece of physical evidence that had been overlooked in the initial sweep of the park. It came from a cell phone. In February of 2017, 6 months after Karina Vetrano's murder, a young man named Chanel Lewis was stopped by police in a separate, unrelated incident in East New York, Brooklyn. He was 20 years old, no significant prior criminal record, nothing in his background that would have flagged him in a conventional investigation. He was not on anyone's radar. But during that stop, investigators obtained a DNA sample. And when that sample was run against the profile recovered from Karina's body, the profile that had been sitting in the system for 6 months, waiting, it matched. The match was described by investigators as near certain. The statistical probability that the DNA recovered from Karina Vetrano belonged to anyone other than Chanel Lewis was, according to forensic analysts, essentially zero. This wasn't a partial match or a familial hit that required further interpretation. This was a direct, clean, unambiguous identification. Chanel Lewis was arrested on October 4th, 2017, 14 months after Karina's murder. He was charged with second-degree murder and predatory sexual assault. And then he did something that almost never happens cleanly in high-profile murder cases. He confessed. The confession, one as it was later presented in court, was detailed. Lewis told investigators that he had been walking through Spring Creek Park when he encountered Karina on the trail. He described the attack. He described the violence. He described leaving her there in the reeds and walking away. Prosecutors had what they needed: DNA evidence and a confession. By any conventional measure of a criminal case, this should have been straightforward. It was not. Almost immediately, the case became something larger than the crime itself. Chanel Lewis is black. Karina Vetrano was white. And in the charged atmosphere of 2017, in a city still navigating deep tensions around race, policing, and the criminal justice system, that fact did not go unnoticed. Lewis's defense attorneys moved quickly to challenge the confession. They argued that it had been coerced, that their client, a young man with no prior experience in police interrogation, had been psychologically manipulated into making statements that didn't reflect the truth. They pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline. They questioned the conditions under which the confession was obtained, and then they challenged the DNA. This is where the case entered territory that most people following it from the outside didn't fully anticipate. Because challenging DNA evidence in a post-conviction world, in a world where DNA has become synonymous with certainty, is an extraordinarily difficult argument to make. But the defense made it anyway, and they made it with enough force that it couldn't simply be dismissed. The question they were asking, underneath all the legal language, it was a simple one. Are we certain, or are we just certain enough? In a case built on science and a confession, that question should have had a clean answer. Instead, it opened a door that would take 2 full trials, years of litigation, and a community's worth of grief and anger to even partially close. The courtroom was waiting, and nothing about what happened inside it would be simple. Let's talk about confessions, because in the American criminal justice system, a confession is supposed to be the closest thing to certainty that a courtroom can produce. A person, in their own words, saying, "I did this." It carries enormous weight with juries. It shapes the entire architecture of a trial. And in the court of public opinion, it tends to close the conversation before it fully opens. But the science of confession, and there is a science to it, tells a more complicated story. Research from the Innocence Project and decades of criminal justice scholarship has established something deeply uncomfortable. Innocent people confess to crimes they did not commit, not rarely, not in isolated edge cases, with enough regularity that it has become one of the leading contributing factors in wrongful convictions in the United States. The reasons are varied but well documented. Prolonged interrogation without adequate rest. Psychological pressure tactics that are entirely legal under current law. The Reed technique, an interrogation method widely used by American law enforcement that involves presenting false evidence, minimizing the moral weight of the crime, and creating a psychological environment where confession feels like the only available exit. Young people, people with cognitive vulnerabilities, and people with no prior experience navigating police interrogation are statistically more susceptible. None of this means Chanel Lewis was innocent. What it means is that a confession, on its own, is not the end of the analysis. It is the beginning of it. Lewis's defense team, led by attorneys who understood exactly how this argument would land in a racially charged case, built their challenge around 2 pillars. The first was the confession itself. They argued that Lewis, 20 years old, no prior criminal record, no experience with formal police interrogation, had been subjected to hours of questioning in a high-pressure environment and had ultimately told investigators what they wanted to hear, rather than what was true. They pointed to specific inconsistencies between details in the confession and established facts at the crime scene. They argued that some of what Lewis described could have been fed to him by investigators, consciously or not, during the interrogation process. The second pillar was the DNA. This is where the defense made their most technically ambitious argument. They did not simply dispute the match. Disputing a direct DNA match in a modern courtroom is an almost impossible task. Instead, they challenged the integrity of the sample collection and the chain of custody. They raised questions about potential contamination. They brought in their own forensic experts to scrutinize the methodology used by the NYPD crime lab. It was a sophisticated, layered defense, and it was built, at least in part, on a foundation of genuine legal principle. The idea that the burden of proof in a criminal case is not merely high, it is absolute. Beyond a reasonable doubt means exactly what it says. Outside the courtroom, the case had become a flashpoint. Phil Vetrano, Karina's father, was a visible and vocal presence throughout, attending proceedings, speaking to the press, carrying his grief publicly in a way that was impossible to look away from. He had been a firefighter. He understood duty and loss in a particular way, and his anger when it surfaced. Hadrian was the anger of a man who had already lost everything and was watching the process of accountability stretch out across years. On the other side, members of the Lewis family and community advocates raised concerns about whether a young black man from East New York was receiving the same presumption of innocence that the system promises everyone in theory and delivers unevenly in practice. Those concerns did not exist in a vacuum. They existed inside a long documented history of racial disparity in the criminal justice system that no honest accounting of this case can ignore. Both of those things were true simultaneously. And the courtroom, as it so often does, became the place where the city tried, imperfectly, loudly, painfully, to hold them both at once. The first trial was about to begin, and it would not go the way anyone expected. The first trial began in October of 2018, 2 years after Karina Vetrano's murder, and just over a year after Chanel Lewis's arrest. By the time the jury was seated and opening arguments were delivered, the case had already accumulated enough complexity: the DNA challenge, the confession controversy, the racial dynamics, the grief of a family that had become a public presence, that a clean, straightforward verdict felt unlikely. It was. The prosecution's case rested on two pillars that, in combination, they argued were insurmountable. The DNA evidence, recovered from Karina's body and her fingernails, matched to Chanel Lewis with a statistical certainty that their forensic experts described as effectively absolute. And the confession, detailed, recorded, obtained after Lewis had been read his Miranda rights and had waived them. The defense countered on both fronts. They attacked the DNA methodology, raising questions about the NYPD crime lab's handling of the samples and the possibility of contamination. They attacked the confession, arguing that Lewis had been psychologically worn down over hours of interrogation and had ultimately produced a statement that reflected the pressure of the room rather than the truth of what happened in that park. And then they introduced something else, a counter-narrative about Lewis himself. They presented him as a young man who was mentally and emotionally vulnerable, someone who had struggled with social isolation and psychological difficulties that made him particularly susceptible to the kind of interrogation tactics the NYPD had employed. They were not arguing that he was legally incompetent. They were arguing that the circumstances of his confession made it unreliable. The jury deliberated, and then they came back with something that satisfied no one: a hung jury, deadlocked, unable to reach a unanimous verdict on either the murder charge or the sexual assault charge. The mistrial sent shockwaves through the case and through the community. For the Vetrano family, it was a devastating extension of a grief that had already stretched across 2 years. For Lewis's supporters, it was a signal that the evidence was not as airtight as prosecutors had presented it. For the city, it was confirmation that this case was not going to resolve cleanly, that whatever happened next would carry the weight of everything that had come before it. The prosecution announced immediately that they would retry the case. The second trial began in 2019. The core evidence was the same: the DNA, the confession. But both sides had spent the intervening months sharpening their arguments, anticipating each other's moves, and preparing for a jury that would arrive with some awareness of the first trial's outcome. The prosecution tightened their presentation of the forensic evidence, bringing in additional expert testimony to reinforce the integrity of the DNA match and preemptively address the contamination arguments the defense had raised in the first trial. They leaned harder into the confession, walking the jury through it methodically, detail by detail, arguing that the specificity of what Lewis had described could not have been the product of suggestion or coercion. The defense held their ground. They continued to challenge the DNA. They continued to argue that the confession was the product of a psychologically compromised young man in an inherently coercive environment. And they continued to ask the jury to hold the prosecution to the full weight of the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. This time, the jury came back with a verdict: guilty. Chanel Lewis was convicted of second-degree murder and predatory sexual assault on October 21st, 2019, 3 years and 2 months after Karina Vetrano was killed in Spring Creek Park. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and raw. Phil Vetrano wept. Members of Karina's family embraced. Outside, When in the hallways and on the steps of the courthouse, the response was more divided. Relief and grief on one side, anger and disbelief on the other. Lewis's attorneys announced that they would appeal. They had grounds, they said. Juror misconduct claims had emerged during the proceedings, allegations that at least one juror had conducted independent research during deliberations, potentially tainting the verdict. Those claims would become the foundation of a post-conviction legal battle that is still, as of this recording, ongoing. But in that moment, in that courtroom, the verdict was what it was: guilty. And for the Vetrano family, after 3 years of waiting, of fighting, of carrying their grief through 2 trials and a hung jury, in a city that had watched all of it, it was at minimum something. Whether it was justice is a question this case has never fully stopped asking. Sentencing in a case like this is never just a legal proceeding. It is, in many ways, the moment where the courtroom stops being about evidence and argument and becomes something more human. A space where the people most directly devastated by a crime are finally given the floor. Where the weight of what was lost is allowed to exist without objection or cross-examination. Where a judge, bound by law but not stripped of conscience, decides what accountability looks like in years. Chanel Lewis was sentenced on January 30th, 2020. He received the maximum sentence available under New York law: life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will not leave prison. But before that sentence was handed down, the courtroom heard from Phil Vetrano. And what Phil Vetrano said that day is the kind of thing that stays with you. Not because it was polished or carefully constructed, but because it wasn't. It was the unfiltered language of a father who had spent 3.5 years carrying something that no human being is built to carry. He spoke about Karina, about who she was before she became a case number in a headline and a name read aloud in a courtroom. About the runs they used to take together through Spring Creek Park, side by side in the early morning or the late afternoon, in the rhythm of a ritual that belonged entirely to them. He spoke about the morning he stayed home. That detail, the back injury, the one day he wasn't there, is the kind of thing that a parent never stops turning over. What if that has no answer and no bottom? Phil Vetrano didn't perform his grief for the courtroom. He simply told the truth of it in plain language, and the room absorbed it in silence. Lewis, given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, maintained his innocence. That is his legal right. It is also, in the context of a case built on DNA evidence and a recorded confession, a statement that the Vetrano family and the prosecution received with the particular exhaustion of people who have been fighting for years and are not interested in reopening what the jury has already closed. The judge imposed the maximum: life without parole. And yet, even in that moment of legal finality, the case was not finished. The appeals process had already begun. The juror misconduct claims were moving through the system. Lewis's attorneys were building arguments that, if successful, could theoretically result in a third trial. The conviction was real. The sentence was real. But the legal machinery that surrounds a case of this magnitude doesn't stop simply because a verdict has been reached. For the Vetrano family, the sentencing was an ending of one kind. For the courts, it was the beginning of something else entirely. A conviction is not the same thing as a closed case. That distinction matters, especially in a case like this one, where the legal proceedings didn't end with the verdict, where the questions raised during 2 trials didn't simply dissolve because a jury reached a decision, and where the machinery of post-conviction litigation continued grinding forward long after the sentencing was done. Chanel Lewis's attorneys filed their appeal, and the grounds they cited were not frivolous. The centerpiece of the post-conviction challenge was juror misconduct. During the second trial, allegations emerged that at least one juror had conducted independent research during deliberations, looking up information outside the evidence presented in court, potentially introducing material that neither the prosecution nor the defense had the opportunity to address or challenge. In the American legal system, this is not a minor procedural complaint. The right to a fair trial includes the right to have your fate decided by a jury that is working exclusively from the evidence presented in the courtroom. Outside research, regardless of what it contains, is a structural violation of that principle. The question the appeals court would have to answer was not whether the research happened, it appears that it did, but whether it was prejudicial enough to have affected the outcome of the trial. That is a high bar. Courts are generally reluctant to overturn jury verdicts on misconduct grounds unless there is a clear showing that the outside information materially influenced the deliberations. And whether that bar was met in Lewis's case is something the appellate courts have been working through. As of this recording, the conviction has been upheld, but the legal fight has not been abandoned. The American appeals process is not a retrial. It is not an opportunity to re-argue the facts of the case or present new evidence in most circumstances. What it is a review of whether the legal proceedings that produced the conviction were conducted fairly and in accordance with the law. Grounds for appeal typically include ineffective assistance of counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, improper jury instructions, newly discovered evidence, and, as in Lewis's case, juror misconduct. The burden falls on the defense to demonstrate not just that something went wrong, but that what went wrong was significant enough to have affected the outcome. It is a deliberately high standard designed to preserve the finality of jury verdicts while still providing a meaningful check on the process. In practice, it means that most appeals fail, but the ones that succeed matter enormously, both for the individuals involved and for the integrity of the system as a whole. Beyond the formal appeals, there are questions about this case that the legal process was never designed to fully answer. Why was Chanel Lewis in Spring Creek Park that day? The confession described an encounter, an escalation, an attack, but it did not provide the kind of psychological architecture that allows people to understand how something like this happens. There was no established prior relationship between Lewis and Karina. No clear motive beyond the immediate circumstances of the attack. No history of similar behavior that investigators uncovered and made public. That absence of explanation is not unusual in cases of this kind, but it is unsatisfying in the way that violence without comprehensible origin is always unsatisfying. Because understanding why doesn't undo what happened, but it does something important for the people left behind. It gives the grief somewhere to go. For the Vetrano family, that somewhere has never fully materialized. The conviction gave them accountability. The sentence gave them permanence. But the why, the full human, comprehensible why, remains just out of reach. And in the silence where that answer should be, the questions keep living. There is a version of this story that ends cleanly. A young woman is murdered. Sure, DNA evidence identifies her killer. He confesses. He is convicted. He is sentenced to life in prison. Justice is served. The end. That version exists. It is factually accurate, and it is completely insufficient. Because what this case actually contains, if you're willing to sit with it honestly, is a set of tensions that the verdict resolved legally, but never fully resolved humanly. It contains a father who ran the same trails as his daughter for years and was home with a back injury on the one day it mattered. It contains a community that was broken open by violence and then asked to hold simultaneously the grief of a family and the complexity of a criminal justice system that does not deliver its outcomes equally across race and class and neighborhood. Or it contains a young man whose guilt was established in a court of law and who has maintained his innocence through 2 trials and years of appeals. It contains a confession that a jury believed and a defense that argued, with genuine legal foundation, that belief in a confession is not the same thing as certainty about the truth. None of those tensions disappear because the gavel came down. What this case asks of us, and I think it asks this genuinely, not rhetorically, is whether we are capable of holding complexity without collapsing it. Whether we can grieve Karina Vetrano fully and completely, as a person and not just a victim, while also asking honest questions about the system that processed her murder. Whether we can acknowledge the reality of racial disparity in criminal justice without using it to erase the reality of what happened to her in that park. Those are not comfortable questions. They are not the questions that true crime content usually makes space for, but they are the questions that this case specifically demands. Karina Vetrano was 30 years old. She was a speech therapist who helped children find their words. She ran through Spring Creek Park with her father because it was theirs. A ritual, a rhythm, a piece of ordinary life that belonged to them. She was full of the kind of energy that people around her felt and remembered. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone's colleague, someone's person. She deserved to come home from that run. She deserved decades more of ordinary Tuesdays. Coffee in the morning, work that mattered, runs through a park she loved, evenings with a father who would have kept running beside her for as long as his legs allowed. She didn't get any of that. And no verdict, no sentence, no amount of legal finality gives it back. What we can do, the only thing we can actually do from where we sit, is remember her accurately. Not as a symbol, not as a cautionary tale, not as a data point in a conversation about DNA evidence, or racial justice, or interrogation of psychology, though she is relevant to all of those conversations. As Karina, 30 years old, Howard Beach, Queens, speech therapist, runner, daughter, the kind of person who made the people around her feel like the day was already worth something. She ran that path 100 times. Home on the 101st, she needed someone to be there, and no one was.